Okay guys, so this is a new topic today. You're going to be learning about food webs and food chains and how the energy gets distributed to different parts. So meaning if an animal eats another animal, where does that energy go? Or how does the animal get that next energy? Okay, so and we have things at certain levels. I know you guys have probably heard we're at the top of the food chain. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, the different levels of the food chain or food webs. Okay, so this is topic 12C. You should be able to understand and analyze the flow of matter and energy through food webs, food chains, and energy pyramids. Okay, so you're going to make sure you have your energy and trophic level notes on the side so that you can be typing in your notes as you go along. Please make sure you pause as needed. All right, so if some of you are kind of going, what do I need to know for the quiz? This is kind of one of those, by the end of today, you need to be able to identify organisms at each level, meaning you need to know what producers are and what consumers are, and are they primary consumers, are they secondary consumers? And you also need to be able to identify the organisms that are in multiple levels. So sometimes there are organisms that can be primary and secondary. And then just to be able to analyze the food chain and what would happen if one was taken away. Okay, so here should be the very beginning. You don't necessarily have to write this. This is just a understanding. But the sun is the energy source for nearly all life on Earth. Okay, so plants need the sun and we need plants, right? We get oxygen from plants, and if the plants don't have sun, they can't make oxygen. So if we were to say what's the main source of energy for everything in life, it would be the sun, right? If we had no sunlight, that would pretty much deplete all of our living resources that we have as humans and animals. And so the trees would end up dying. We wouldn't have the plants to eat. We wouldn't have the oxygen that we use. Okay. So this one's already written for you. But trophic level, it's just your position or an animal or an organism's position on a food chain, food web, or food pyramid. So down at the very bottom, you have your producers. These are the guys these are the plants, the greenery that produces energy from the sun. They actually produce their own energy. They make their own energy from the sun, right? We can't physically sit out in the sun and get energy, but plants can. And so this is a large box down here at the bottom because there's a lot more plants, a lot more producers than there are animals on Earth. Okay, so there's a lot of producers that produce the food that we end up eating along the way in our trophic levels. Okay, and what we mean by trophic levels is each level contains a certain amount of organisms or a certain level of organisms that eat at certain levels. Okay, herbivores are those that eat plants, so they would be the next level up. So these herbivores are like grasshoppers or like squirrels that eat nuts and things like that, that eat primarily just greenery or producers. So whatever's in the level above it can pretty much eat what is below it. Okay, so the herbivores eat the producers. So there's a lot less of them than there are producers. And then you have your small carnivores. These are things that eat herbivores or eat smaller animals. Okay, so these small carnivores can be, I'm trying to think of, so this can be something like a snake that eats a mouse. A snake could be a small carnivore and the herbivore could be the mouse. And then you've got some large carnivores. The large carnivores can be the things like the hawks that eat the snakes, and the snakes that eat the rats, and the rats that eat the plants. So these are just the different levels based off of what they eat. And as you notice, there's less and less, but you also get less and less energy as you go through the trophic levels. So all the energy for the producers is produced by the sun. So they get 100% of their energy from the sun. The herbivores, the plant eaters, are the ones that they get less than that, right? So when they eat the plants, they're getting only a percentage, and we'll talk about the percentages in just a little bit, but they'll only get a percentage of energy, and that's because they're having to move around and go and find food. So they're wasting energy before they can go and consume or eat the energy, right? The plants. So we'll talk about this and the different trophic levels in a whole nother video. Okay, so here's where you start your notes. So what are producers? Producers produce their own food through photosynthesis. Okay, so these are leaves and any type of flowers and fruits. And so they get their energy from the sun. They can just bask out in the sun and they get the energy that's needed for them to grow and stay green. There's other things that they need, but primarily their energy source is the sun. Okay, and they use photosynthesis for that. So we'll talk about photosynthesis in a later topic, but right now you need to know the word autotroph. Okay, autotroph means self-feeder. They can feed themselves, meaning they can create their own energy automatically. Okay, self-feeders. So just like an automatic door, it opens by itself, right? So maybe there's like a little sensor, but you don't have to physically put your hand on it to open the door. So this is like an automatic troph, a self-feeder, okay? They are the base of every food web. So at the very bottom, the first level of every food web or food chain is always going to be a producer, because we have to have those producers to feed the herbivores. And so that's our main source of energy, is the base of the pyramid. Go ahead and pause as you need to and write your notes. Okay, so which organism would be classified as an autotroph? So think about these different things. Mammals, which are like whales and humans, plants, fungi, or insects. Okay, so technically plants would be considered an autotroph. Plants can sit out in the sun and get food. And you would think fungus or fungi like mushrooms, but mushrooms are very similar, I wouldn't say to humans, but they have to digest their food. They have to actually physically extend and go and get food. So they would not be considered an autotroph. Mushrooms cannot sit out in the sun and get their own energy or get their own food. Okay, we're going to talk about heterotrophs as well, but it's just the opposite of autotrophs. Autotrophs are self-feeders. Heterotrophs are other feeders, meaning they have to eat something other than themselves to get energy. Okay, so as a mammal, I have to physically eat meat or beans or lettuce, or I have to eat something other than myself to get energy. I cannot sit out in the sun and automatically create my own energy, right? So that would be things like mammals and fungi and insects. They have to eat something other than themselves for energy. Okay, so what are consumers? Consumers are organisms that obtain energy from eating other organisms. So you're a consumer, you have to eat something, right? Plants don't have to eat anything for energy. So they are not considered a consumer. They're a producer, right? They produce the energy that we eat. But consumers are those that actually just have to eat something other than themselves. Okay, so they have to eat other organisms. And some examples are herbivores, those that eat only plants; carnivores, those that eat primarily meat or only meat; omnivores, those that eat both meat and plants; and decomposers, those that actually live on dead and dying things, decompose it, and use that as their energy source. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the different levels. Hopefully you remember from the very beginning that the very bottom level are your producers, they're the plants. This is going to be your second level. These are going to be the ones that eat the plants, okay? And they're called primary consumers or first consumers. They're going to be the ones that first eat in the food web or food chain. Primary consumers eat producers, meaning they eat plants. And they're herbivores, they're plant eaters. Okay, so pause as you need to, fill out your notes. But these are the guys in the next trophic level, the next level that eat the plants. Okay, so here's a food web or a food chain, and this one's sideways, so you don't actually have your producers at the bottom. but this is how they would show it on the STAR test. So here you have grass. This is going to be your producers. And the first thing to eat the grass are going to be your primary consumers. So I'm just going to kind of go through this food web and explain it. So the grass gets eaten by the grasshopper. The grass also gets eaten by the rabbit. The grass also gets eaten by the mouse. So see how the arrows are going towards the organism that's eating it? The arrow just means that's where the energy is going. So when the mouse eats the grass, the energy from the grass is now going into the mouse. So the mouse will now have energy from eating the grass. Okay, and so this is going to be your producer that produced all the energy, and these are going to be your primary consumers that will be the first ones in the food web or food chain to consume the producers. So first eater, second eater, third eater. And what we call those are primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. You literally just kind of have to follow the arrow. But as you notice, arrows are kind of coming from all different directions. So this would be your producer, primary consumer still, and then you'd go all the way here to this arrow, and now he's also a secondary consumer. So see how he's primary, secondary, tertiary here? But in this food chain, he's producer, primary, secondary consumer. So this hawk can be a primary consumer and a secondary consumer, depending on which food chain he's in. So if he decides he's going to eat a lizard, he's going to be a tertiary consumer. If he decides he's going to catch a grasshopper, he's going to be a secondary consumer, and so on. Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Okay, and if you see, all the arrows lead up to this hawk. So he's at the top of the food web or food chain. He can pretty much eat anything he wants in this scenario. So the question is, which organisms are primary consumers? So the mouse, yes, that would be a primary consumer. The snake would not. The snake would be a producer, primary, secondary consumer. It would be a secondary. The lizard would also be a secondary, and the hawk could be secondary or tertiary. So the only one in this scenario that could be a primary consumer would be the mouse. Okay, now you have your secondary consumers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. So these are the guys that are at the second level of eating at the food web or food chain. Okay, these are your carnivores and your omnivores, the ones that eat both plants and animals. Pause as you need to write your notes. Okay, so now which organism is a secondary consumer from this scenario? So what I would suggest is if you have your notes or you have a food web or food chain, go ahead and label it. Put P for producer, and then put like 1C for primary consumer, or you can just put PC for primary consumer, and SC for secondary consumer, and TC for tertiary consumer, so that when you have them all labeled, you can go back to this question several times and quickly answer it. Okay, so let's go back through and see which one would be a secondary consumer. Grasshopper would be a primary consumer. The mouse would also be a primary consumer. The lizard would be a producer, primary, secondary consumer, so that will fit in, so C. And then the rabbit would unfortunately be a primary consumer. So the only one that makes sense would be C, lizard, secondary consumer. Okay, now tertiary and quaternary, so the third or fourth levels that eat, okay? So these are the ones that eat the secondary consumers, and the quaternaries eat the tertiary consumers. We typically don't go this high up on the food web or food chain, but there are instances where you will. And so this is where you will see your producers down at the bottom. The primary consumers are the ones that eat the producers. Secondary eat the primary. Tertiary eat the secondary. And quaternary eat the tertiary. Yeah. Pause as you need to. And then you're going to answer this question, and we're going to have to unfortunately go on a new video because I only have 15 minutes on this video.